Up next, we're going to sort of dive into some of the techniques and some of the technology that you can use to make your cattle a little bit more efficient and more productive. We've got three of the sort of experts in the industry coming up. You're going to talk a little bit about implants. So we've got Dr. Kim Ominski. So Kim Ominski is a professor in the Department of Animal Science and the director of the National Center for Livestock and the Environment at the University of Manitoba. Since joining the university, Kim has established a multidisciplinary research program focused on the productivity and sustainability of beef cattle production in Western Canada. She was also honored by the Canadian beef industry with the award for outstanding research and innovation in 2023. Alongside her, she will be joined by Betty Green. So Betty is a rancher from the Interlake region. And her husband Robert and their grandson Curtis together own G7 Ranch in Fisher Branch. They run approximately 600 Simmental cross cows. They have a small herd of full bloods, and then they also sell some purebred Charolais. So their goal is to background and sell high performance crossbred tan calves. And then the third member of the trio is Mary Jane Orr. So Mary Jane is the general manager of MBFI, Manitoba Beef and Forage Initiatives Incorporated, here just north of town. She leads a dedicated team to advance Manitoba beef and forage industries. She herself grew up on a mixed farm in southwest Brandon and completed her Bachelor of Science in Botany from Brandon University. She then went on to get a PhD from Purdue University's, where she studied soil microbial ecology and agricultural systems. She's a professional agrologist, certified crop advisor, and manure management planner. So I'll get you to give them a round of applause and welcome to the stage.
Is this working? Yes, it is. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and particularly to share the stage with these two individuals who are real assets to our industry. For anybody involved in the beef industry, mark these two people's names down and keep them as a contact. They've been just a tremendous resource for my family. So we're going to talk today about going green with implants, and I'm going to start out from a very practical cattle producer's perspective, and then I'll be passing it on to the real experts. Now, changing the slides. How do we? Nobody gave me. There we go. All right. We'll get this figured out. All right. So there's a few indicators. World population is going to go up in the next 25 years by 2 billion people. So that's a lot of people that are going to need to be fed. Global meat production is also going to go up. In the next 25 years, predicted to be 9.4%, and for cattle, that's almost 8%. That means we're going to need to produce more beef. So how are we going to meet those demands? Certainly, I think we've all learned and started to practice improved sustainability and rural development, technology and productivity, growth, and of course, ongoing support for farmers, trade, and market. But we're going to be talking about the technology and productivity. So improving productivity, any cattle producers have, of course, looked at genetic selection, reproduction, feed management, and growth enhancement technologies is the topic of the day. So what kind of enhancement technologies are out there? There are the growth promotants or growth implants. That's what we're going to talk about. But of course, there's also the feed additives, MGA, ionophores, for example, and some of the newer products that we're looking at, enzymes, essential oils, probiotics, and direct feed microbials. So, G7 Ranch. My husband and I Started in 1982. We actually started long before that. We were farming in southern Manitoba, but in 1982, we established G7 Ranch in Fisher Branch. It's 3-generation operating now, and pleased to say the 4th generation is starting to arrive. So in 1982, my husband and I and 4 children moved to Fisher Branch. The picture that you see here is probably about 4 years old, and it has definitely even expanded further. Currently, it's my husband and I, and without any doubt, you can tell we're on the very end of our farming time. So the new additions, Curtis and his wife Brandy, and their little guy, Rowan. I don't think there's anything more rewarding than to see the next generations take on our ranching initiative with such passion. And even Rowan loves to get out there and feed his animals. So, as was said earlier, we've got about 600 cows. We've got it kind of split 3 ways. We've got some full-blood Semitols and some purebred Charolais. Those are used to develop some of our own genetics so that we can try to crossbreed and develop those tan calves with the Semitol Charolais cross cattle. And what's the story on implants? Well, over 30 years ago, we were looking at how to enhance the production of our herd. And of course, implants came into discussion. And because of reaching out and asking a few questions, we were asked to participate in an on-farm study where they implanted half of our calves and left the others as a control group. And needless to say, by the end of the summer, when we brought in those calves and started to weigh out the differences, we were sold. So today, we keep our calves, so we wean them, put them in our own feedlot, and background them until they're about 800 or 850 pounds, at which time we sell them to a finishing lot. So we started out by doing an implant for calves when they were turned out to pasture. We quickly realized that we needed to re-implant them at weaning. So that's the protocols that we have today. So let me just ask a couple of questions of the audience. How many of you implant calves that are still on the cow? Yeah, we've got a few. Great. And what about weaning calves or implanting calves at weaning and then keeping them to background? Yeah. So we've got a few of those too. Good. For those that don't, anybody want to share why not? Okay. And are you selling them into that currently? Good. Anybody else? Well, I'll share why initially I was nervous about adding implant. Who's going to do that? Who's going to take a hold of a calf's ear and try to get an implant positioned in the right place? And how long is it going to take? Well, pretty quickly we found out that it wasn't nearly as onerous as we thought. And guess who ended up being nominated to put in the implants? Me. Mainly because I was at the head gate anyway, and it just worked well, and it really doesn't take very long. Now here's a video of the proper technique. Do we have sound? Is there sound? maybe if we're not getting sound, I'll just try to translate. The location has to be about mid-ear, and you always try to get it to avoid any of the veins or cartilage. You set it and just secure the ear and slide that just under the skin, and then use your gun to inject the implant. Now, you do have to have a good head gate. We certainly don't have one that tips the calf. Just a regular head gate is what we use. He's just giving us an example, and you can see where the needle went in. There's a little bit of a hole. We just rub it to try to close that and ensure that we're not getting any additional germs, and that we close off that the incision or the site where it was put in. Now, a lot of people say, well, if the calf's tipped, that would make it easier. It may. I've never tried it. But it's remarkably easy once you get into an idea of how you would do that. We have pretty standard way of doing it. I do an injection of a vaccine on one side. There's usually somebody else on the other side. They do the other injection. Meanwhile, I'm grabbing the implant gun, holding the ear, and as soon as that injection on the other side is done and the calf's still thinking, okay, this is it, I administer the implant. And 90% of the time, the calf doesn't move. I'm not sure whether they're just thinking about all that's going on. I tend to kind of hiss, like, shh, or something like that. And they listen, and that helps to maintain their still. I think it works. Maybe it doesn't. So what are the impacts of using implants? Here we're taking a look at pre-weaned calves. So these are the calves that we put an implant in, usually about 60 days of age, sometimes a little less. And it's usually when we are turning out onto pasture. Here we're just showing the one column with no implants, the last column with implants, and you can see the difference in gain. And at the bottom, we identified the increased profits. So we were using the January 10th average weight, or average price for calves between 500 and 600 pounds. And on 100 calves, it amounts to about $15,000. That's quite significant. Certainly a paycheck added for very little effort. And somebody asked what a cost of an implant would be. This implant for us this spring is $2 per calf. Now the second part of our program is when we wean. So 2 weeks prior to weaning, we run all of our calves through to do the second booster vaccines, and that's when we do the second implant. And again, you can see the impact of the use of that, the top column being heifers as a control group, so no implant. Second column, including the implant. The third is using MGA on heifers. The second last column is steers as a control group, and the last one with implants in the steers. And what you're seeing here is on 100 head. Let's just take a look at the heifers, $5,727, and on the heifers, the steers, just over $10,000. So that's pretty significant. We see the benefit from both of those, the first slide and this one. Now, we don't finish very many cattle on our farm at all, but we decided to include a slide for post-weaning growth of finished cattle. And again, you're seeing the fed yearlings, both the control group and then the use of the implants, and the second one on calf-fed cattle. And as you can see, $17,000 and $27,000, again using January 10th average prices. So there's definitely benefits to using implants. And now I'm going to turn it over to the experts.
Use that word very loosely. Thank you very much, Betty. Oh, thank you. Okay, so in 2023, at MBFI, we're a research and demonstration farm, so even though we're kind of a stepping stone between the producer, like Betty, who has 600 head at MBFI, our herd size is quite a bit smaller, so our sample size for our control heifers was only 22 animals versus 27, 40 steers, and just about 39. So we're more at that 130 calves that we were looking at in 2023. And what we were interested in doing, we worked with Manitoba beef producers, and we wanted to demonstrate the use of an implant, and then we're a little bit younger, so we implanted just over 30 days. So we're April-May calving, predominantly Black Angus or Black Angus cross cattle. So they would have been born April or May, and they would have been implanted like late June, early July. So they're pretty young when they got that implant. It was the Ralgrow implant. In 2023, it cost us $1.73 a dose. And then we're weaning at early November. So our kind of 5-year average would be that 550-pound weaning weight. But our weaning weights in 2023 were a fair bit lighter. And one point that I'd like to kind of point out in that both those groups, they actually had similar heavy animals and similar light animals. So kind of depending on the in-herd variability, it wasn't like all of the implanted calves were all at the high end and all of the non-implanted calves were at the really low end of our calves. The influence of whether they were born in the first cycle, second, or third cycle were more influential. So we had a variability in each group. So we would have some heavier calves that weren't implanted, and we had some implanted calves that ended up being lighter. So we had a variability within our herd, but when we took the average and did a paired t-test, we still had a difference in the average group daily gain. So we were gaining about an extra 0.2 pounds per day overall in a group. So when we look at the difference over that summer season, and we're not backgrounding anything, so we're weaning those calves in November and marketing them. So we're not doing some of the best practices that Betty's doing. So we are marketing those calves in November, and they, with that, just that extra 30 pounds per head on the prices that we got. So those are actually our true, what we marketed our calves for. Prices ended up being a $90 or $94 advantage, or it could be an opportunity cost. So if we had have implanted the calves that we didn't, we would have made an extra $94 per head. So saw a similar pattern with the steers. So when we add it all up together, we were looking at about $6,000 difference. And when I presented this information at the district meetings, kind of an interesting question is, and we asked at the beginning is, what would influence a producer to or to not implant? And I think as the example that we heard already, like if you are marketing your calves into a natural market or into the EU market, or you are taking advantage of a market advantage of not implanting, I think that makes a lot of sense. How we manage our cattle is a very personal to our own beliefs. But the challenge I put forward is, if you're like us and you're just putting your calves into an auction mart, very likely they could go into a downstream production system that is going to be using any number of the different growth promotants that we heard about at the beginning of the presentation. So if we're not taking advantage of a marketing advantage of not using promotants, we're really leaving money on the table, or we might want to think about the money we're leaving on the table if they're just going into the open market. So that's kind of the producer perspective on it. But let's go into some of the consumer perceptions. So what are some of the ideas of why you would have the consumer demand for beef? Ultimately price, and that's going to be very influential. I mean, we've seen that happening. We've seen beef prices becoming very much more of a premium product, and it's not something we're eating every day unless we have our freezers full of home-raised beef. The other factors that we have are quality. So we know that we produce a really high quality of beef in Canada. We know that it is incredibly nutrient dense, and we're very confident in eating Canadian raised beef. So just last night we had Amy Peck from the Canadian Cattle Association talking about public perceptions of the beef industry, and one of the really surprising takeaways is how much consumers believe in the Canadian beef supply. And we really have a job to do to continue communicating on what a good job we're doing as cow-calf producers in environmental sustainability. So if you look at a little bit older survey data from 2016, we have about 25% of Canadians indicating a willingness to pay an additional premium for natural beef. What that looks like under the current changes to the price of beef has gone up and up since 2016. So whether or not consumers would still be willing to pay a premium for natural beef, I think is an open question. And then we also had 58% in 2012 about the consumers indicating preference towards natural beef. And a really good thing to highlight is that's claimed behavior. So what you respond to in a survey may not be actually what people are making decisions in the grocery store. If we look at consumer perceptions, again, looking at the Western Rural Development Center, if we look at the price premium, and if you're the percentage of participants willing to purchase locally raised ground beef, and that's an emphasis on local, not necessarily naturally raised beef, but just to know where that beef came from, to know that it was done with sound production practices, you're looking at an equal price. So you're seeing a willingness of, sorry, I don't know what UT stands for. Utah and Nevada, the two states, okay. So we're seeing that there is within between these two states, that with an equal price, you're having almost probably 68% more willing to want to eat locally raised at various price markups. So we're seeing that support. I'm going to hand off to Kim, who is the actual true expert and has done very well designed experimental design. So looking forward to this. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks very much, Mary Jane and Betty. And you know, Betty made a comment about us being the experts, and I certainly wouldn't consider that to be the case. Betty and I met each other many years ago when I was a livestock specialist with Manitoba Agriculture, and I was giving a presentation to the Forage Beef Club in Fisher Branch, and that was Betty's Beef Club, and I've had the pleasure of working with her for many years, and she's held many important roles in the industry, including the leader of Manitoba Beef Producers at a very difficult time during BSE. So for a second, Betty, you can't convince anybody in this room that you're not an expert. Okay, so the title of the presentation is about going green. And so the green part in terms of the cash value or the increased value, you've just seen in both what Betty and Mary Jane have presented. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the environmental sustainability. And over the course of my career, I've done a lot of work in this area because, as we all know, there are comments regarding the sustainability of the beef industry. And I think it's really important that when we have these conversations with consumers, which is what Mary Jane just referred to, that we have some of this factual information to back up what it is that we're saying about it. So I just want to acknowledge there's a whole team of people behind this research that I'm going to present. It's certainly not only mine, and we do a lot of collaborative work with researchers across Western Canada and actually with feedlots. So we've done some work with feedlots here in Manitoba as well as in Alberta, including some of Key Jim's cattle. So what are the environmental concerns that we hear about from consumers? Certainly greenhouse gas emissions, that's not a surprise to anyone. And the fact that agriculture is responsible for anywhere between 8 and 10% of Canadian greenhouse gas emissions, land use and land use for cattle, water consumption, and then ammonia emissions. So we just talked about this international demand for GET-free beef, and that certainly is an opportunity. And I think it's important that we recognize that there isn't a one-size-fits-all in the industry. And with the signing of the CETA agreement, certainly some opportunities or predicted value of about $600 million at the time of signing annually for the Canadian economy. Mary Jane showed some data that shows, an interest in producing or in consuming, or claimed consuming, of both local beef or hormone-free beef. And of course we know that burger chains, right here in Canada, of course, promote implant-free beef as well. But I think it's also important that we take a look at what the trade-offs are, or the benefits of beef raised with and without the use of PETs. So this is a study, a Canadian study, some data of a feedlot in Alberta, and this is specifically feedlot. So I'm going to look at feedlot, and then I'm going to look at post-weaning, and then I'm going to look at pre-weaning in terms of environmental outcomes. So in this study, it was backgrounded in finished cattle. It was actually conducted over 4 trials, so we are fairly confident in the data. And these were animals that were, 120 British Cross, 80 steers and 80 heifers, and they were backgrounded for 84 days and then finished for 148 days. And of course, we looked at things like body weight, average daily gain, days on feed, dry matter intake, and then carcass quality as well. The treatments that we had were control heifers, implanted heifers with TBA, trend-blown acetate implants, MGA, and then control steers and implanted steers. And then we also, in the last 2 years, had a ractopamine treatment. And we looked at greenhouse gas emissions, so we're fortunate to have a model that we use quite frequently that was actually developed in Alberta, and it's a Holos model, and it's reflective of the Canadian production environment, and so we're fairly comfortable with the data that we get from that it's applicable to Western Canada. We looked at land use, and that really includes the amount of land that was required to produce the feed that were fed to the cattle. We looked at water use, not only drinking water, but also the water required for crop production, and then a little bit of that is processing plant water. We looked at ammonia emissions, primarily from manure and manure application, and we did not include synthetic fertilizer in this work. So what did we see? You can see there's a baseline value, and we looked at, as I said, greenhouse gases, ammonia, land, and water, and primarily that's because those are the areas that we hear most often about from consumers. And you can see that in all cases, whether we're talking about the TBA implanted heifers and steers, MGA heifers, or the ractopamine steers, that in all cases we saw a reduction in those 4 environmental metrics. So more specifically, we saw somewhere between a 3 and 10%, depending on which treatment we're talking about, of a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for every kilogram of boneless beef that was produced. We saw a 5 to 10% reduction in land use per kilogram of boneless beef, a 5 to 11% reduction in water use, and a 3 to 8% reduction in ammonia emissions. As I said before, we then looked at post-weaning steers. This is actually some data that came out of a couple of trials in Saskatchewan. In that one, there was 3 different classes of cattle: heavy calves, medium weight calves. So heavy calves were about 295 kilograms, medium frame calves were about 250, and light were about 205. And of course, as would be in a production system, they had different paths in terms of their finishing. So those heavy calves went straight to feedlot. The midweight calves were backgrounded in confinement and then finished, and the lightweight calves were backgrounded. They were grazed on pasture over the summer and then placed into the feedlot. Similar data was used to go into the model. And the HCON, those are the steers of each group, heavy, medium, and light. We implanted half, and half were not implanted. And then there was, for the rest of the treatments, they were standard management practices. And here again, you can see that for that group of backgrounded and finished calves that came straight from post-weaning, that we saw a reduction in each of the 4 metrics: greenhouse gases, ammonia, land, and water. And so anywhere between 10 and 11% greenhouse gas emission reduction per kilogram of boneless beef, 9 to 22% decrease in land use, 11 to 24% reduction in water use, and a 13 to 32% reduction in ammonia emissions, depending on which group of calves we were looking at. And then last we actually looked at pre-weaned calves, so implanting those calves from birth. And in this case, we looked at some data that actually came out of the US, and we looked at 3 different scenarios: implanted calves compared to non-implanted calves only up to the time of weaning. And then the second scenario said that we looked at that group of calves from implanting post-calving, and then we looked at, that's what I'm saying, post-calving, I mean 30 days of age, and we looked at what happens when you implant the half the group and don't implant the other half, and then assuming those animals all go to a backgrounding lot where they're all implanted, and then finished, and then the last group is that one group of calves was implanted all the way through, and the other group of calves non-implanted all the way through. And this really just describes sort of that same thing: birth to weaning, birth to finish with the calves implanted after weaning, and then birth to finish implanted and non-implanted all the way through. And again, you can see all those 4 metrics, scenarios 1, 2, and 3, we saw a reduction in all 4 of them, or else no change in all 4 of them. So more, and we talked about the differences in income, so I'm just again capturing here what those differences are. About $12,000 difference in that first group of those animals up till weaning, and then when we get to scenario 3, where those animals have been implanted or not implanted all the way through, obviously a lot longer of a period of time, all the way from that 30-day mark up until the time of finish is over that $100,000 mark. So again, for that group of calves, anywhere between a 1 and a 5% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, a 1 and 5% reduction in land use, anywhere from a no change to a 7% reduction in water use, and a 4 to 23% reduction in ammonia emissions. So from this, you can see that regardless, and in addition, of course, it changes in income, anywhere between $12,000 and $114,000, depending on if those calves were implanted up only to the point of weaning, or implanted from at 30 days up until the time of finish, which is the highest value there. So what are the real world implications of this data? So certainly, both Betty and Mary Jane presented data, and we know there's an abundance of data out there that shows that growth enhancing technologies like implants, for example, improve not only feed efficiency, but they also improve average daily gain. And that's because we have fewer days on feed, resulting in lower costs of production. But we can also now say with this data that certainly they're a sustainable strategy for improving food security, so we're getting more beef produced while we decrease greenhouse gases, ammonia emissions, as well as land and water use. Now, we talked about the opportunities to increase prices, and this gentleman over here mentioned specifically that's what we're doing, and that certainly is an option to consider, and a reason why you might not choose to implant your calves if you can capture those increased market prices. There have been some comments about whether implants are indeed safe or not, and I wanted to just show you this data. This actually looks at different food products, so it's got 75 grams of beef, both implanted and non-implanted. It's got chicken, pork, beer. Of course, none of you would drink beer, milk, cabbage, soybean, and actually a birth control pill. And then it shows the estrogen content that's associated with them. So if you hear the comment that implanted beef has higher hormone levels or higher estrogen levels associated with them, you can see that certainly that's not the case, and there's a lot of other food products that have higher hormone content associated with them. So just a few last thoughts that I'd like to share with you, and then I'm sure the 3 of us would love to answer any questions that you have. So we've shown increased production efficiency and obviously increased economic sustainability, but also I think this data shows that clearly it's much more environmentally sustainable. And this work is really an important first step to talk about how the Canadian beef industry have really adopted management practices that have improved the sustainability of the industry over the course of time. And this information should help consumers make informed decisions about their food choices. And then, as I said before, I think we certainly always have to recognize that there's room in the marketplace for a variety of production systems, and there is no one size fits all. So I think it's really important as we continue to talk to consumers about beef production that we look at finding shared values with them and having these conversations with them. And there's lots of opportunities. The Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, I'm going to show you some data for them in just a minute. Ag in the Classroom is another one. We're doing work at the U of M, and Mary Jane is doing work at MBFI, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, to help find or help have those opportunities where we can dialogue with consumers about this information, not only the production information, but also the environmental sustainability information as well. And so we might ask ourselves, well, who do consumers trust and who should be having these conversations with consumers? And then we can, I think, each ask ourselves, what can we do and what role can we play in this ongoing dialogue with consumers? So I'd like you to take a look at this information, and I'm always marvel at it, and I'm always very happy to share it when I give presentations, including to our students at the U of M. And this is some work from the Canadian Centre of Food Integrity, and I hope you can see very clearly at the very top of that, who do consumers trust? And this is, the green line is Manitoba, just because it happened to be some data that was conducted in Manitoba, and the bottom line is all across Canada, and they're very close to each other. But what does this say? Who's at the top of that list? Farmers are, which means that consumers trust what farmers have to say. Next is scientists and the ag sector and researchers. I'm not sure how scientists and researchers actually differ from each other, but that really says to us that we all have a role to play in terms of having these conversations with consumers about where their food comes from. And of course, as we know, we talked in the previous presentations, fewer farmers, larger farms, but that means that many consumers never have had and I'm going to use it as the word privilege, have never had the privilege of actually being on a farm. And so as a consequence, the conversations that you have with them are about these sustainability metrics are really important. And so I'd like to just share for a second some of the work that we're doing at the university, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mary Jane. But a number of years ago, we developed the Bruce D. Campbell Farm and Food Discovery Center. And that was because we had a lot of school age children or teachers that were asking us to come to the university because many of their students had never been on a farm before. And to be honest, I mean, you can, from a cropping system perspective, there's not much you can do. You can only bring kids to the farm from September, and then, kids are finished school in June. And so you have a very small window of time when you actually have crops on the field at the same time that the students are in school. We could bring them to our livestock operations, but they weren't really set up to do, public outreach. And so we had this investment in the Farm and Food Discovery Center, and it's really a hands-on learning center for kids. So we do a lot of classroom visits there, but we also, it's open to the general public to come at any time. And we host an event there every fall, and I marvel at these numbers myself. Every fall, we open it's free for anybody who wants to come and visit on this particular day. And it's on a Saturday afternoon every fall, somewhere about the second or third week in September. 2 years ago, in the 5 hours in which it was open, 1,600 people came to the farm that day. This last year, it was slightly lower, and I think it was somewhere in the ballpark of 900. And those are just people who are looking to learn more about where their food comes from and about farming systems in Manitoba. And within the last year, there's over 4,000 visitors. We do a lot of school trips and school programming, about 200 field trips every year. About 57% of those are Winnipeg schools, but about 43% are also rural schools. And then we also have a virtual outreach program as well. This is the beef display that's within the Farm and Food Discovery Center. And so there's the, students can come through and do these hands-on activities. And because the interest in the center has grown so much, more recently the dairy producers have also invested on site there in addition to swine and beef, which were the two that I just showed you. And the dairy producers have invested, and they have a building as well where people can come in and see current modern milking systems. And then more recently, just I guess about a year ago in June, we have an egg layer facility on site as well. So really, I think there's opportunities, for us at the farm, but there's many, many opportunities for things like Ag in the Classroom and other places where we have the chance to engage with the public, and I would encourage you to do that. And I'm going to just turn it over to Mary Jane so she can talk a little bit about the public outreach work they're doing at MBFI. Thank
you, Kim. Our front monitor went out in case you're wondering why we're all looking over here. A lot of you will already be pretty familiar with what we do at MBFI. We're just north of Brandon. We're really scaled as a commercial cow-calf farm at that 100, and our goal is to get up to 150 pairs. We have 2 farm stations. At the Brookdale Farm, we have a learning center, which allows us to host groups. And really, in our mission of what we do at MBFI, our primary audience is producers, and to evaluate different practices, share that information, and support the decision-making for producers in their own operations. But building on that, we do have an opportunity to share that information to other audiences as well. So we have been building our capacity to host field trips. So this is actually Waverley School, and we were able to do a calving demonstration. We had them come out for a field trip and basically set up, I think it was about 4 different stations where they would learn about different aspects about cow-calf production, see the type of landscape where cattle are being raised, and get some exposure to some different information. We also hire summer students, so they get to experience in the implant data I showed you. It was really great. We hosted Merck, who sell the Ralgrow product, and we did a workshop where all of our summer students learned how to properly implant. So we're really integrating hands-on learning across multiple stages. So all of our summer students and staff come through and they get the full taste of what it is, both on just a farming perspective, but then also how we support academic research through collaboration, but then also do on-farm demonstration at that lower level of scientific rigor, but really talk about that variability in the data across a landscape as well as within a herd. And then we get to showcase new technologies as well, which is always exciting and fun. So the previous presenter talked about virtual fencing. We got to try that out this summer, and we can talk about our experience and the quirks and what you may want to think about if you're trying it yourself. And really, we wouldn't be able to do it, all the things that we do, without partnership with Manitoba beef producers, as I mentioned before, but also with Ducks Unlimited Canada and the Department of Agriculture with Manitoba government. And really, as I already mentioned, our whole goal is to share that information to multiple audiences. And as we get more opportunities through Forage clubs especially, but also really building the potential. So we're behind the curve of where the Food and Farm Discovery Center is, or Development Center is, but we're working towards building that capacity for the Brandon students to start hosting, build on our wins, both working with the Assiniboine Community College students that may be in the room to bring them out for a calving workshop in February, but to build the opportunities for just to see what a farm actually looks like, but manage some of the risk of having the public on your farm as well. I'll turn it back to you.
So thank you very much for your time and attention this afternoon, and if anybody has any questions, we would love to answer them. It's hard to see, actually.
I have a question about the research farm.
Yep.
You do a lot of work targeting the younger generation, ag education, and youth. Has there ever been any focus on the older generation, so the information isn't lost by the time they get home from school?
Sorry, were you asking Mary Jane?
Both of you.
Okay, you go.
Sorry.
That question really would be for both of you. I absolutely love the amount of work that goes into ag education, but I often wonder then, how does that information go home with those kids and then get transferred to the parents who are making the ultimate buying choices in the homes? So I just wondered if you've had any discussions about targeting that next step audience. You know, you have the school kids come, but maybe it's bring your parents to school day, something to that effect.
Absolutely. I've really noticed it in the 4-H clubs. So when we have a club come to visit, so we'll develop kind of an agenda for the day, and it's the parents that come is sometimes the best question askers, and some really good dialogue and kind of conversations following up. So we'll do our presentation and interactive activity with the kids, and then especially around low stress handling, it can sometimes be fun because you have like the little comments from the back row, the adults, and I can call them out, and it's a pretty fun and engaging process. We haven't had the experience with school groups coming through. We've only had 1 or 2. And so how that translates from what they're learning, I think we'll continue building our relationship with Ag in the classroom and leveraging on the work that they do and complementing it and supporting our volunteer activities with schools. So when we go into the school for Ag in the classroom, and then really our goal is to build relationships with local teachers so that we can start working towards that. So we're still really at the beginning stages, but again, balancing our focus of our mission. Like our focus of our mission is to be there for producers, but the really amazing thing of what we do, and at the university level too, is that you can do some work, but it appeals to so many different audiences, and how you tailor that messaging to different audiences is a really exciting area to be working in.
Thank you very much for your question. So within the Farm and Food Discovery Center, so there's a couple of ways that we try to get that adult audience in. So one of them is Open Farm Day, it's now called Ag on the Farm Day, where we get, like 2 years ago we had 1,600 and this year we had over 900. Like, we did not expect that at all, and those are parents bringing their children, and sometimes it's just adults. And so there is an appetite for that kind of information, pardon the pun, but for sure we know that there's a genuine interest, and you know, it's in all the times that I've been there, I've never had a controversial conversation. People might come up to you and say, I heard that, and then they'll tell you what they heard, but we have never actually had anybody come up and say, you know, in a really aggressive sort of way. It's just people who really want to know. So what we find is when we bring in the school groups, then we've started doing like pumpkin carving or Christmas on the farm with Santa, or like they do seasonal themes, pizza making day. And that's when kids from schools will then come home and tell their parents, oh, we did this, and then they go home with a list of activities that are coming up, and then they come back with the parents again. Or they offer birthday parties there, and now they come back and say, they come home and say, oh, I want to do my birthday party there. And so that's how you sort of get that parental involvement as well. But I agree with you, it is a really important element. The other thing that we've done is science teachers workshops, where you give workshops to science teachers and then they take kits back to the classroom with them. And then there's also a lot of a real emphasis now on high school kids who have an interest. So for example, the Fertilizer Canada does a day with high school kids, like kids who are really keen on science, and then we bring them in and we do different. So we do one session with them, for example, on beef. We talk about the grasslands and sustainable grasslands. They take a look at the Ducks Unlimited video, and then we show them, you know, rumen fluid in a microscope and how, the rumen can actually digest all this plant material that other animals can't, or that humans can't use. And then those kids actually get, because they're really into the science of it, they get really turned on to it as well. So yeah, great question. Other questions?
Do you see a large benefit to the use of implants over the other types of growth promotants that were talked about, I think Betty talked about earlier in the presentation?
So maybe I'll just touch on, so in the data that I showed you, we used actually a combination of, that's why you call them growth enhancers. We looked at MGA, which is specifically for heifers, and then we also looked at ractopamine in steers. And so there are differences in the response of animals, but in each case, they all led to an advantage over conventional. We've also done some work where we've looked at essential oils. Betty made reference to those. And although they may have some advantage, they don't have the same advantage as we've seen with the standard growth-enhancing technologies. Yeah, good question. Thank you, Ireland.
No, we just tried one product, and it was such a short window and a small sample size, so I'm always really cautious about when you witness there's so many influencing factors for variability, so that's why you see they're really large. For academic research, where you're really making those claims for the Canadian, like CFIA, and whether or not, like making sure our food is safe, that research is done with such massive study size, like 600, 1,000, multiple, like just really big numbers because of the variability between animals. So the work we do for our demonstrations at MBFI really have to be taken with a grain of salt, and it's about building on or demonstrating things that are already proven in the research world, and then we can just kind of showcase it and have a conversation around different products. We've only tried that one product that was RalGrow, which is for market, like made, if you check the BCRC website about growth promotants, they have a really nice breakdown of all the different products and the different class and age of animals they can be used on. I wouldn't be able to speak to that other than that we would have to follow up with the pharmaceutical companies. So I know for the one that we worked with, it was Merck that provided it, and it would be all of the different pharmaceutical companies will have their own products, and they'll all have similar active ingredients that may have different formulations, but where they're commercially produced, I wouldn't be able to speak to that. Yeah. All the time, yeah. So we don't have, we're a lot like a commercial farm in that we're building our capacity, but we have 2 farm stations, so we're kind of hither and there all over the place, kind of running around getting things done. So we can't have an open door where people can just drive up, and you might be able to catch us, but if you call ahead or contact us, we can schedule a meeting. So we always welcome farm visits. We just have to schedule them in advance. And then we host a lot of extension events. So whether they're hands-on workshops in the Learning Center or something that I'm talking about with we have some new hires that we're building their competency in hosting extension events, but especially around low stress handling, we're looking at hosting those where we work with our cattle that are maintained year round. When we did the growth promotant implant training, we just had it for our summer students, but the opportunity to, if we were to do that demonstration again and just say on this day we're implanting, and if you want to come, that is something we're looking at doing in the future, to be public about when we're doing different things. So whether it's putting the e-shepherd collars on, because that can be a little bit touchy, a little bit of so some pinch points, and putting the collars on the neck. So if farmers are looking at buying them, they can come and stand at the head gate while we're putting the collars on ourselves. So we're thinking about how we can be more interactive with our day-to-day farm operations as well. So if you're curious, just follow up with me. We have a booth. I think we're not shutting it down quite yet. I think we have to stay there till 5, so you can follow up with me afterwards at 5.
And I just wanted to make a comment about your question about ingredients and products. So all of these products would have to have approval in order to be used in livestock. Yeah. Go ahead, Betty.
I'd just like to make a comment. I started out talking about why we started using implants, and I always feel guilty because we really did it because of the dollars. But now we realize so many benefits that really weren't being promoted at the time in terms of environmental impact and sustainability. The second comment I want to make is there's a lot of young people here, and I wish I were your age, not only because of being young. I wish I could start cattle ranching again at your age, because I think there's some tremendous opportunities. So go for it.
Okay, no last questions for the group here? No? Okay, well then, yeah, join me in giving a round of applause, and thank you to these lovely ladies for the wonderful presentation.
I think you guys should all get a round of applause for making it to the end of the day on Thursday.
Yes, so definitely give yourselves a round of applause. I know Ag Days it's been a long 3 days. Hopefully everyone has enjoyed their time here at Ag Days and gotten everything that they could out of it. I personally have enjoyed being the MC for this session this afternoon. And I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next year. And yeah, all the best in 2025.